Senator Menendez from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Black and Latino households are more likely than white households to live in poorer and disadvantaged neighborhoods. As Congress considers an infrastructure package, we have an opportunity, I believe, to help address racial disparities in access to affordable housing and economic opportunity by targeting aid to low-income communities. And I believe the best way to do that is with a package that spurs development and investment in underserved communities by coordinating housing and transit development so our communities can improve economic resiliency. Dr. Reese, would an infrastructure package that provides specific investments to low-income communities help address some of the racial disparities present in affordable housing and economic opportunity?
Thank you for the question, Senator. Absolutely. We know that the alignment of transportation infrastructure and housing is critical, primarily in the context of allowing greater workforce mobility. But in addition to that, it helps us think proactively in terms of understanding that with these transportation investments that we may see, particularly in our urban neighborhoods, property values are going to go up, and we can potentially stabilize housing to make sure that those neighborhoods stay affordable and accessible. I'm here in Central Ohio, where our regional planning agency right now is trying to think about how to prioritize higher density transportation development along our arterial corridors and also preserve affordable housing. A program like this would be actually transformational in moving ideas like this off of the books in terms of planning and into implementation.
Well, thank you. So then it would be fair to say that you think including coordinating fair housing and transit development that expands housing opportunities and transit access to good paying jobs as part of an infrastructure package would help these racial disparities.
Absolutely.
And that's exactly what my Livable Communities Act does, which would authorize new programs that help to promote smart development and regional planning for transportation and affordable housing, especially to better integrate affordable housing availability and access to transit, and access to job opportunities. So I look forward to hopefully working with the chairman on that. Thank you. Let me ask Ms. Rice, home ownership, we know, is one of the most effective ways for low and middle income families to build intergenerational wealth. The Federal Reserve tells us that the median homeowner has about 40 times the household wealth of a renter. The Census Bureau data tells us that as the fourth quarter of 2020, only 44% of Black families, 49% of Hispanic families own their homes, compared to 74% of white families. So, Ms. Rice, federal data shows that the median white family has 8 times the wealth of the median Black families. Does the home ownership gap contribute to this wealth gap?
Yes, Senator Menendez, absolutely it does. In fact, the homeownership gap is the major driver of wealth inequality in the United States. And so that's why it's imperative that we adopt programs that help expand homeownership opportunities for people of color. And I do want to make a point here. Because in the lead up to the Great Recession and the foreclosure debacle, the kinds of loans that we saw to and hyper targeted for communities of color were toxic mortgages that were not designed to be sustainable. And that's critically important. In fact, over 50% of African Americans and 50% of Latino Americans got loans in the subprime market. They got these really horribly crafted subprime loans in order to purchase their housing. The point I want to make is that that's always been the case in the United States, right? There has never been a time in the United States when the primary mainstream financial market has been the primary provider of credit to communities of color because of this legacy of discrimination and these systemic inequalities that we've been talking about, the dual credit market and so forth and so on.
Yeah,
So
and Yeah, and we certainly want responsible borrowing, but we also want the ability to create that responsible borrowing to take place. But at the end of the day, we see that the wealth gap isn't static, it widens over time. One final question to Mr. Rothstein and Ms. Rice. If owning your home is part of wealth building, but also if homes are properly appraised and valued, a Brookings Institute report from 2018 shows that home values in majority Black neighborhoods are 55% lower than homes in less than 1% Black neighborhoods. So how does this systemic undervaluation happen, and what are the consequences to African-American households?
Well, thank you, Senator. Let me begin by saying that
The two Republicans on this thing is.
oh, shall I go on?
Yes, please.
Yeah, please proceed.
Senator,
Scott, I
thank
think
you.
Yeah.
Thank you. First, let me say that home ownership is a critically important thing to maximize. People who own their own homes have more pride in their communities. They take better care of their neighborhoods. They are more invested in their local schools. So nobody should minimize the importance of increasing ownership that is presently denied to African American families. But we should also be careful not to over-exaggerate the effect that home ownership has in wealth creation. Historically, African Americans who have owned their homes have gained less wealth from them than whites who've owned their own homes, because African American neighborhoods appreciate and value less than white neighborhoods do. It's certainly true, and I said this in my comments earlier, the wealth gap that we have today is largely created by discriminatory federal home ownership policies. But that's not the only thing that sustains it. We should not forget that if we want to increase wealth of African American families and other minority families, we should enable them to save from decent incomes. Income policies is critically a contributor to home ownership and to wealth, rather. It's an important contributor to wealth creation, as housing policies are. And we shouldn't silo our attention to the housing and income policies when we're talking about wealth creation. We can narrow the wealth gap if we give families enough income to save from, the way white families do as well. So far as the appraisal issue goes, you're absolutely right. This is one of the things that a disparate impact, well-enforced rule could address. But many people confuse appraisal and assessment. And one of the critical problems that we now face, and I'm sure you've seen all the attention given to it in just the last few weeks as a result of a very important report that was issued by a political scientist at the University of Chicago, Christopher Berry, showing that systematically across this country, African Americans, because of discriminatory, in effect, assessment policies, pay far more in property taxes than whites for homes of similar value. This is the results, the causes of this are obvious. So for one thing, because as I said, African American neighborhoods appreciate less rapidly than white neighborhoods in value. If you don't do a regular assessment, and many communities don't do it, they delay their assessments. Over time, white homes market values are going to be much higher than their assessed values, while Black home market values are not going to be so much higher. The result is that African Americans are paying much higher property taxes to support schools and fire departments and other public services than whites are. These are not racially explicit policies. They're policies that across the country, the Berry report documents 1,800 counties and cities in which African American neighborhoods, low-income neighborhoods, pay higher property taxes relative to market value than white property taxes. Unless we begin to impose a disparate impact standard on the assessment practices that are imposed across the country, we're not going to solve this problem. And when African Americans pay higher property taxes than they should, that depletes their wealth as well, because they're dipping into their savings to pay property taxes that are unaffordable. It causes sometimes their homes to be foreclosed. Cities and counties condemn their homes and resell them to speculators for only the defaulted property taxes. This is a critical problem nationwide that's depressing the wealth of African Americans, and that should be addressed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Menendez.